The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. I'm Amit Bando. I'm the Senior Director for Clean Energy, Environment, and Water here at Winrock, and I'll be moderating the discussion. So we have a very interesting, hopefully a very interesting set of presentations and discussion on this topic of paradoxes of resilience in agricultural development. And this particular title came about in a very interesting way. We were initially going to talk about something related to resilience, but didn't really come up with this particular angle. And this is interesting, and I wanted to share this with you, that as we started talking and as the proposed today's panelists started sort of discussing this, we realized that resilience sort of means different things to different people. And while we start with what may be considered a standard definition, and this is the one that we'll base our discussion on, it's clear that resilience can be viewed as resilience that people, as individuals or communities, or even at a bigger scale, regions and nations have two different kinds of shocks. And these shocks could be shocks coming from climate change, which is a very narrow definition, but also other environmental impacts. And so then if you start thinking about it, it's resilience to shocks from natural disasters, from economic conditions, changes in economic conditions that could be local, regional, global. So clearly, the idea of resilience and how we address this could mean different things to different people, and would also mean that the kinds of responses, kinds of decisions that are involved, they'd be nuanced. And so this seems like a very good discussion to have, open it up to this broader audience here. And again, welcome everyone, those that are here in the room and those that are online. So what we thought would be a good idea would be to have a very short set of presentations. You know, each panelist will present some initial ideas. Hopefully that'll, allow us, the broader group, to have some thoughts. And we are encouraging you, to those that are online, to submit questions, and we'll hopefully turn that into a nice discussion at the end of the first round of presentation. So treat this as an open dialogue, nothing very formal. I think the takeaway from here would be, hopefully we'll exchange some ideas, some thoughts, and further discussions on this topic, because clearly there are lots of things we ought to be looking at. So the panelists come from different backgrounds: agriculture, finance, and climate resilience in particular. And so we thought that this would be a good mix of people. And as a result, we're going to, before I introduce the panelists, I wanted to go back to the whole webinar series that we have here. We call it the Innovation at Winrock Seminar Series. The idea is that we meet fairly regularly on a consistent basis to talk about topics of international importance in the area of development and environment, new concepts, new ideas, get some lesson shares, some takeaways, and what kind of new approaches we ought to be looking at. This is the whole idea of a dialogue and a discussion, and we encourage you to suggest topics. Also, if you would like to participate in any of our webinars, I think we would really welcome that. So any thoughts along those lines, please share those with us. Next seminar scheduled for June. A little bit about Dr. Sandra Brown, who used to be a director here at Winrock. She's a pioneer in carbon accounting and tropical forestry, who as most of us know, was recognized when the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. And so this seminar series is dedicated to her and her strong commitment to work in this area. So once we, so now, yeah, let's quickly go over and introduce the panelists. Our first panelist will be Charity Hanif, who is Winrock's Chief of Party based out of Mozambique. She is Chief of Party on a USAID project. It's a Feed the Future project called Resilient Agricultural Markets Activity, or RAMA. So Charity will talk to us from Mozambique and share some of her thinking on resilience-related issues and how they're handled within RAMA and what broader implications there are from the work that she's doing. Second panelist is Michael Rinaldi, and Michael is Assistant VP for Sustainable Business Development at Rabobank and Kickstart Food, based out of New York City. So Michael's going to talk about experiences at Rabobank, and Rabobank is doing work throughout the globe on resilience-related issues, and that, his approach to resilience, how we handle this, and what lessons we get out of the Rabobank experience. I think Michael will share some of that initially, and hopefully during the discussion we'll be able to get more into the intersection of agriculture and finance and how that is used to address resilience-related issues. Finally, Joel Smith, who's a principal with Apt Associates and based out of Boulder. So Joel's going to talk initially about climate change related issues and how he, as a climate change adaptation expert, views resilience, how he uses that concept to develop his work. And again, of course, during the discussion, hopefully we'll talk about the overlaps and intersections with agriculture, with finance, with climate change. So with that, let's just go straight to Charity's presentation, I guess. And the way we will proceed is each panelist will speak for about 5 minutes. And if you have any questions, hold them. We will hopefully roll them into the panel discussion that we hope to have at the end of those presentations. And again, those that are online, please make sure that you write in your questions so that we have them.
Thank you. I hope that everyone can hear me from Mozambique. As was mentioned, the next slide, I'll just kick right off. Next slide, please. So I'm leading the RAMA, Resilient Agricultural Markets activity that's located in the Nacala corridor. And we're implementing activities in Nampula and Zambezi provinces in the north of the country. And within this area, we have generally 3 agroecological zones that we're working in: the highlands, the coastal, and mixed, which has some implications when we're prioritizing interventions and technologies. What will impact positively the resilience of the smallholder farmers across such a diverse area and such a large area. One of the things that we think about, or at least from my experiences, is that farmers are farmers are farmers. Rain-fed farmers globally make similar decisions and evaluate risks in a very similar way. And irrigated farmers across the globe often make decisions and evaluate risks in very similar ways. Next slide. And the differences between these farmers globally and between different scales is the market system in which they're operating. And so their access to information, their access to services, and their access to technologies is what differs greatly. And so for successful farmers, our program, we're looking to enhance access and adoption of agricultural products, services, and practices, as well as develop the private sector to offer interactive information platforms. There really are no libraries that farmers could go to, or cooperative extension offices as we have in the US, where they can search information that's relevant to them. Given the diversity of the area and the farmers that we're working with, you know, there is no single answer to increasing the resilience or creating successful farming households. But, you know, as was keyed up in the introduction, what is resilience? What does a successful farming household really look like? Next slide. We have a number of definitions that implementing organizations and the public sector are all discussing in northern Mozambique. And in many cases, it's a fairly narrow definition, but as a program, we needed to come up with a working definition of resilience if we're going to positively impact resilience for households. And we came across a definition in a USAID-funded report, Market Systems for Resilience: the ability of people, households, communities, countries, and systems to mitigate, adapt to, and recover from shocks and stresses in a manner that reduces chronic vulnerability and facilitates inclusive growth. And our program is most specifically looking at households and systems. And this definition actually allows us to consider many different aspects, again, as was introduced, not just the climate or environmental resilience. Next slide. So we're looking at economic resilience, environmental resilience, and community resilience, or household resilience. And there's a lot of trade-offs when it comes to decision-making for the smallholder farmer. Something, you know, a typical priority for a smallholder farmer is to maximize yield. And yet, maximizing yield may actually be with a variety that has reduced environmental resilience to, for example, poor soil quality or extreme temperatures. On the other hand, with community resilience, labor shortages may result in decisions, or land shortages may result in decisions that, that can negatively impact what might be a clear decision in economic resilience. And so there's a lot of trade-offs in the decision making where resilience in one area, prioritization of resilience in one area may actually result in an impact or a risk exposure in another area for the household. So I want to go through a couple of examples, just, you know, what does this look like? So next slide. So in the trade-offs for a farmer, for example, in hiring mechanized land preparation services, you know, it's very cost competitive to hire labor to do land preparation. So it's cost competitive, and there are increased yields that are achieved only by adopting mechanized land preparation and complementary technologies. So often without mechanization, you don't see adoption of other technologies. But you know, the trade-off though is that it could reduce the organic matter in the soil, increase soil compaction, and may not be the most environmentally resilient activity in certain agroecological zones over the long term. These are trade-offs that the farmer needs to understand and needs to make. Access to production credit is another example where it absolutely facilitates extensive growth of production area. Without access to credit, you can't grow the area under production, and you may not be able to adopt other inputs such as new crop genetics or fertilizer. But for rain-fed crop systems, particularly where crop insurance is not available, it significantly increases the farmer's risk profile. You know, if the market drops, you know, now you've got this credit, or if there's a crop failure, now you've got this credit and you have an increased risk profile. And finally, a drought-tolerant seed variety. is adaptable to agroecological areas where you're seeing increasing rainfall variability. And it's being used by farmers in these areas as a risk mitigation, where they might plant a certain percentage of their area with drought-tolerant seed varieties. Why are they not adopting 100%? Because in good years, many times these varieties don't offer the same yield potential as the highest yielding options out there. And so they might adopt part of this as a risk mitigation, but you may not see 100% because of the trade-offs. So next slide. That's my 5 minutes. Actually, it's, I think, closer to 6.5. And I just wanted to present this as an introduction to sort of these trade-offs and paradoxes in resilience.
Thanks, Charity. And I think, as was promised, we see that there are these differences and trade-offs between the environmental side and the economic and financial side of this equation. So what I hope is that we jump straight into Michael's presentation and hold the thoughts on where these trade-offs occur. And of course, the next logical question is, what do we do about it? What are some decision-making points? And what do we learn as a result of this kind of recognition of the trade-offs? So we'll hold those for the discussion later. On to Michael.
All right. Well, thank you for that introduction. Let's see. Next slide. Oh, there we are. Okay, so to introduce my topic, I think Charity's presentation really sets it up nicely. One of the things I want to talk about today, the challenges of financing, mechanization among smallholder farmers, and the paradoxes with the resilience that you have there. So next slide, please. To set this up and first introduce myself and in what role I'm going to be speaking to in this capacity. So currently I'm the Sustainable Business Development Manager at Rabobank out of New York City, focused on wholesale banking. But just before I started working here, I was at DLL, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Rabobank. And at both places, through the Rabobank Foundation, there really is a focus on sustainable development in addressing resiliency through expanding access to finance, particularly for smallholder farmers in Africa, Asia, and South Africa. And as we see, one of the biggest barriers to development is access to this finance. So given Charity's definition as she presented on resilience, one of the areas that we focus on are inclusive growth. So next slide, please. At DLL, one of the areas that we sought to address this was expanding access to finance through microleasing, which is natural for us as DLL, a leasing company or a vendor finance company, to share expertise on. So we advised microfinance institutions on how to implement microleasing as a financial product in many markets where the standard and the most innovative financial product is a microloan. So it was interesting for us to be able to do that. And the way we came to define it is that microleasing was a tool that enabled low-income entrepreneurs in emerging markets to gain access to low-cost assets to enhance their economic livelihood and stimulate economic growth. And so what does this mean? So next slide, please. And this will be interactive, so you can kind of just click through it with me. But in this case, the SACO, or the microfinance institution, would purchase an asset on behalf of the member, the lessee. And I'm sorry if you can kind of, yeah, there we go. And click through with me on behalf of that. And the asset itself would be able to generate income through utilization in the member's micro business. And through that, the micro business, they're able to provide monthly payments that for that asset to the MFI. Continue clicking through, and the asset itself was acting as collateral and reducing the risk, to the MFI, which enabled the MFI, if you click through again, to provide a sustainable source of income, for the member as they are able to acquire ownership of the asset at the end of the lease term. in a way that they weren't able to beforehand. We often saw that the people who were receiving the microleases at the MFIs were young entrepreneurs who, in previous circumstances, had not been able to secure a micro loan for a number of reasons. A lot of times they're young, so they haven't built up credit at the microfinance institution, or they don't have enough connections to get guarantees from other members to take out these loans. So in implementing this financial product, the collateral is able to be taken in the actual equipment that is helping them generate income, and therefore get this access to the finance. So next slide, please. And some of the practices, the best practice where we saw this, really being a shining example of positive development and resiliency. With a few different cooperatives, and this is just one. It's a Beekeepers Cooperative, Hills of Nature, in which Umatongwa and MFI we've been working with were able to finance all of the beekeeping equipment for a group of students, and so they were able to start, a beekeeping company or cooperative and collect and sell honey in the market, from which they were able to pay back their microleasing payments, month to month, as well as pay for school and student fees on top of that. And many of them were studying agriculture in order to further the business ambitions of this beekeeping cooperative. So for them, in the picture you see Prince and Felix, it really was something that had a tangible benefit. They applied for micro loans beforehand, weren't able to obtain them, and this really was a mechanism that will enable them to do so. Next, please. And another example, not necessarily in agriculture, but very popular is with motor taxis in Rwanda. And, really, someone who didn't have a job at the time, able to take out a micro lease on a motor taxi to, give himself a means of making money and a livelihood, able to pay off that micro lease, and at the end they own the asset and are able to continue working, save up, and able to have enough collateral to apply for a loan and to build himself and his family a house. So next slide, please. And this is all getting to the general paradoxes of which we want to talk about. Mechanizing, developing communities encourages economic resilience, but the capital expenditures themselves increase the risk profile to shocks and stresses. And going into this a little bit more in depth, in that, when you're increasing access to finance, you're getting at finance for more risky individuals. It's kind of, comes with the nature of it, but you want to do it in a responsible manner as best you can, and in doing it with the microfinance institutions and being able to do it properly. So, a lot of good in coming and getting the equipment and mechanizing these smallholder farmers and these individuals, but at the same time, with a microfinance institution takes on too many of these, riskier deals, and say something in the structure or with the asset goes wrong, can be something that can be really difficult for the microfinance institution to deal with, as well as the individuals involved. So it's one of those things that we're always, kind of considering and worried about. But next slide, please. There's different ways to reduce the risk, one of which is via servitization, but overall, the high-level thing to look at is that you want high asset utilization in order to maximize the benefits received from that equipment and from that financing, while at the same time minimizing individual risk. So we're able to do this in setting up the leasing with on a cooperative level, where you have 10 to 25 members using the business generating assets. So we've seen this in woodworking cooperative for a large table saw. We saw this with the beekeeping cooperative, with all of the various equipments they have there. They'll get a high rate of utilization, really impacting a lot of different people at once, while spreading out the risk among a larger group of individuals. And additionally, and Charity had mentioned this as well, we're seeing servitization kind of skipping a step of ownership, where you have companies such as Hello Tractor, which are organizing members with tractors who can go out in their communities and provide tractor services to a number of farmers in the area, where those farmers only have to pay for the tractor services that they need, which is competitive with the labor costs that they would generally have in those circumstances. And in this case, all those different members and their payments of tractor services are helping to provide that revenue stream to pay for the financing of that tractor, and really, creating an ecosystem where, the risks are shared, where, it helps out, in the mechanization and the expanding of the farmlands that are able to be grown, and really, kind of building something, rather resilient as we see it. So next slide, please. So that's it for this presentation. Hopefully I stuck to my time, but I'm excited to get further into the conversation. Thanks.
Yeah, and again, I think as you were speaking, one of the things that comes to mind is that in all of these, you were talking about project level and program level initiatives, but one thing that would be nice to talk about is, do you think that at the macro level we have enough protection, enough kinds of regulations that allow for some of this risk to be mitigated, or is there a need for some kind of macro level initiative, I mean at the country level, that would help program level activities? So just throwing that out, maybe we'll talk about this when we discuss further. But let's move on. Joe, of course, open for you.
Okay, thanks, Amit. And I say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where people are listening in from. Let me also just note, thanks for inviting me to be in the Sandra Brown seminar. I had the pleasure of working with Sandra Brown and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I'm glad I can call her a colleague and a friend, so she is missed. And I'm glad you're carrying on in her memory. And I want to just sort of briefly bring in climate change into the discussion and talk about climate resilience and sort of overlay this on both what Charity and Michael had to say. So next slide, please. And so I want to give some general thoughts on how do we overlay climate or climate change resilience onto agriculture development. And then how do we address reducing vulnerability to climate change, that is anticipating the change to come. And finally, I want to close with some thoughts on the role for insurance in climate resilience. Next slide. So the climate resilience questions should be asked about any investment in climate sensitive development. Obviously, agriculture is sensitive to climate. And as we're talking about things like mechanization or finance or whatever, new crops, we might ask, how would these investments fare under climate change? And we might then also ask, once we start considering climate change, do other options, or maybe no investment, that is, say, the status quo, become more attractive? So next slide, I'll elaborate on these. So let's say, in terms of applying climate, the resilience matter, or resilience questions to agriculture, we might ask, how does the potential for hotter and drier, or maybe a hotter and wetter climate, or even changes in extremes events, more extreme floods, more extreme droughts, or even changes in variability, what happens to El Nino, La Nina. What might happen, say, for example, to mechanize agriculture? How would it fare if the fields become flooded, or if they're drier? Would it perform better? And what are the benefits and the costs, say, of mechanized agriculture versus the alternatives, labor-based, or using animals, or using lands for some other purpose? How does the potential for climate change affect those relative benefits and costs? With regard to taking on debt, we might ask, how does the change in climate affect the capacity to pay off debt? One of the interesting issues is what happens, not just in terms of, say, expected yields on average, but to variability, say the frequency of crop failures. Farmers may be able to absorb, 1 in 4, 1 in 5 years where there's a crop failure. But what if that frequency goes up? Does that make it harder for them to pay off their debt, essentially to stay viable as farmers? So next slide. So the next issue is anticipation of climate change. That's part of resiliency too. And typically what we ask is, how do we reduce the exposure, say, and sensitivity of agriculture? By exposure, we mean, are crops or farms and other agricultural livestock going to be in the way of trouble? Like, might they be inundated by sea level rise or flooding or affected by drought? And so should we discourage investment in areas, resilience changes. Another approach is to reduce the sensitivity. You may still have agriculture sort of exposed to these risks, but perhaps the impact is smaller. So, for example, you might develop crops that are more tolerant for extreme heat or drought, salinity, and flooding. And Charity alluded to some of those investments. And then again, we would look at how well do they do under these conditions, but also under normal conditions. All right, next slide, please. And then the third issue is really the true sensitivity and resilience about how to recover, and this addresses insurance. And let's talk about insurance for agriculture. Now, Munich Re reports that about 3/4 of crop losses are from droughts and floods, and clearly insurance schemes for agriculture exist all over the world. They've been around for decades, and it's something that's expanding. But there are a number of issues that arise when you look at enhancing or putting insurance in place or enhancing it. For example, are the governance systems there to support it, not just by the government, but also by the private sector, by civil society? You know, are premiums affordable for farmers, particularly for the poor farmers? Do they need subsidies for the premiums? Should insurance be event-based or cover all losses? Munich Re says that if you make event-based coverage, you only cover about 3/5 of the losses. So, you know, 2/5 of the time you would be at a loss, or you wouldn't get payment. All right, next slide, please. What should trigger payments? This has been an interesting issue. The traditional approach on insurance is that you file a claim after the event, and several problems with this. One is it takes time to make the claim and to get paid, but also it's not equitable. You know, a lot of people don't have access, the know-how or the time to file the claims. They get confused because of the form, so that's a problem. Number of alternatives. One is perhaps making insurance available based on exceedance of a meteorological threshold. For example, amount of precipitation. If we get a very high precipitation event or season, or maybe a low, very low precipitation, that is a drought situation, it could be that we say, okay, there's some trigger here. We might say that, okay, based on this, we'll go ahead and make payments available. This still follows the event, but it would be faster than the traditional approach where you're waiting for farmers to file a claim. Another thing people are exploring is using forecasts to provide finance and actually other support as well. So in this case, you have a forecast that a flood is coming or drought is coming. And based on that forecast, you make the payments available. That's going to be faster than the other alternatives, but then raises the issue of, well, how accurate is that forecast? What if it ends up being wrong? Okay, and I think that's my last slide. Is that? Yeah, so with that, I'll turn it back to Amit.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks, everyone. So yeah, I think as you just, your last couple of slides, you were talking about essentially, within this example, what the issues are. And so maybe one way of starting this discussion off is to say, is to sort of examine this question of, how should resilience be built up? Should it be built up organically, bottom up, at the project, community, individual level? Or, as some of the discussion from all three panelists suggests, that there may need to be some kind of top-down decisions. Again, that could come from the national level decision making, or given we're talking about countries where there's a fair amount of donor involvement, should some of this be sort of imposed is probably a strong word, but something that should be introduced in a top-down way. The question is there a mix there? Are there some areas where we absolutely have to have bottom-up approaches, or are there other areas where we can work with some top-down approaches? Again, given the fact that we have data issues, we have issues related to equity, there's not always going to be the same kinds of desired results or results that will come up if we just approach it at a program-to-program level. So again, with that, I wanted to get some feedback from any one of the panelists, not necessarily a question, but something that hopefully you'll have some thoughts on. Anyone?
Well, I'll jump in. It's Joel. I think this is a difficult question because it really is about enabling change. I don't think a top-down, one-size-fits-all approach is going to work for resilience. I think what governments, let's say particularly role of government and international, and then we talk about international governance, say to the United Nations Framework Convention or other mechanisms need to do is create, the right incentives. A lot of the work on resilience, as we're seeing, is very much in a bottom-up way, and I think that needs to be encouraged, needs to be rewarded. So what government needs to do is how can they step in to make sure these things happen, make sure that the legal system encourages these changes, doesn't discourage it, perhaps provide financing where appropriate, but be careful about where that goes. But again, not stand in the way, but allow for innovation, even allowing for failure and learning from lessons. Also allow this to be developed at different levels. It's not all just doing this at a national level, but letting these things take place at the local level, and among not necessarily among government organizations either. So I think it needs to be organic, but I think it also needs to be supported and encouraged from the top.
Yeah, and I would say that. Oh, sorry, you go, Charity.
Okay, I was just going to add a couple of thoughts from the producer decision-making level. That, as Joel said, there's not going to be one size fits all. Producers really need options and choice, and producers evaluate the trade-offs of any option, product, service, practice, based on the trade-offs for their own situation. But I think two things came to mind during Michael and Joel's presentation. One of the things is that producers have a shorter time horizon when they're making decisions. Experience shows that when they're particularly testing new technologies, things that they don't have experience with, they need to have tangible, observable, and quantifiable value, which also means that an investment that is supposed to pay off over the period of the coming 10 years, or that's the potential value when they're testing something new, adopting that new technology or practice is going to be a harder sell. And so the time horizon in decision making, one of my questions would be in terms of identifying opportunities at a country level is how do you influence that time horizon for decision making for the producer to be able to try things that might be increase their resilience, but in the context of their decision making, they have to use a shorter time horizon without some other external incentive or some framework that changes that time horizon for them. And the other thing is the topic of insurance, which Joel's already spoken about quite well, which is that insurance can be relevant and for various risks, the economic risks, social, in addition to the environmental risks. But yeah, there's been a lot of focus on insurance as a way to increase access to credit. As Joel pointed out, do we have the government systems and the premiums and that in place for the insurance? So I think that at the country level, if we could talk about or test models to change the time horizon for farmers' decision making related to different options to increase resilience, and then also continue to tackle and test to try to figure out the insurance question.
Yeah, and to kind of follow upon a few of those points, you mentioned, talking about, the time horizon that is considered by farmers, and this kind of brings the interplay of, the top-down and the bottom-up approach. Obviously, the lowest common denominator here is, the farmer and what they're doing. And so it really means to, what impacts any of these decisions are having on them. And so, in a microfinance institution point of view, they're going to have deals that, range from, 1 year to 2 years to, maybe 2.5 years at the most, but really as far as, what they can actually support, at that level and what the farmer can actually see from. And so one of the things we try to, build in and build around is, having, the payment be, for, that's, 1 to 2 years, but really trying to build up, the benefits that you're going to have over a longer term with the proper care and maintenance of equipment being applied. And so one of the things we're seeing, you build your business cases at at that farmer level, you get, at the MFI level, build those kind of best practices, if you will. And over time, you can win support at a higher level. So in Rwanda, we saw this in providing, the micro-leases, for these different young entrepreneurs coming up, and eventually found that the Rwanda's Business Development Fund ended up giving 50 to 75% guarantees on micro-leases for students coming out of their technical schools as a way to, get them employment, to get them into the place while also reducing the risk, at the MFI level so they could, take the chance in circumstances and invest, in, development of these, students and their businesses. So yeah, it is quite interesting, and there's no any one particular answer, but that's one interesting way that, at least I've been able to observe it in my experience.
Charity and Michael, you have been talking about how you are working within the communities and working with the farmers. And so one question that comes up, and this is actually something that I'm going to build off of a question we got from one of our online listeners, is, as you look at encouraging these, farmers and communities to work through technology and micro-leasing, insurance, etc., you are obviously promoting this set of activities and promoting resilience within the ecosystems. The question is, how much of this can go on and sort of succeed and sustain itself without involving international parties? I guess the question here is there a strong dependence on outside donors, outside influences, or do you think that there are cases where with very minimal effort you can have a sustainable system? Your thoughts on that?
I'll take a crack at it first. So obviously the goal in any of these projects that we get involved in is to create a sustainable system that can exist without the international involvement. But obviously it takes time and investment to kind of build that, to build confidence in a particular system that you're trying to implement in these communities. But as I kind of had mentioned, with the Rwanda government's business development fund getting involved, that's one example of kind of proving a concept, delivering results, and then you get more local parties kind of stepping into place to provide different areas of support for the sustainability of that. They see that this is a product that when implemented really is expanding the access to finance and creating jobs in these areas, particularly for the youth entrepreneurs or students coming from the technical schools that may have a harder time finding work, being able to put their skills to use that the government's invested in these schools, and so really trying to build a system around it. So a big thing really is collaboration in all these circumstances. It's one of the reasons that I got in contact with Winrock initially around one of these projects. I think particularly it was in Kenya. But really building kind of letting thought leaders in different areas all come and contribute what they know to try to build something that will be lasting. As far as complete looking, as an exit strategy, that's always in mind, but it's also one of the more difficult things to really think about, as far as, seeing the impact that you can have while you're there, and what happens when you do pull out with some of those resources. Have you built a solid enough foundation for it to exist and continue without you? And that's something that's difficult to answer.
Thanks, Michael. I guess my reaction would be that where resilience is lower, typically the market is less developed. So market systems tend to be stronger where the agroecological potential is stronger and more predictable. So as an example, with seed commercialization to smallholder farmers, the seed is often multiplied in the best agroecological zones of a particular country. And if you look at commercial sales, often a lot of the commercial sales to farmers, not to institutions and governments like other NGOs, but to farmers, occurs around that multiplication area to other farmers, because the agroecological potential is higher there. So I think that it's difficult to think about, a small intervention in such a fragmented market system where there are such significant resilience challenges. Our project is in the Nacala corridor in Mozambique, and Mozambique is made up of 3 different corridors: the Maputo corridor, the Central corridor, and then the northern, which is the Nacala corridor. And our corridor is very diverse, but we have an incredibly lean private sector in comparison to the other corridors. So it does take a certain amount of pushing what does exist here to think differently and to think innovatively and to see new opportunities in this area. It's just not happening organically on its own, and we are in a fairly challenging agroecological zone and infrastructure and the other aspects of community, economic, and environmental resilience challenges.
And just to add on to that, I think further consider. I think Charity pointed out a good point about the less developed areas, the poor areas are going to be the hardest to work in. I always have a feeling that adaptation is going to work best where it's needed least. In other words, those that are best capitalized, those that are the most developed institutions, education, they're going to adapt the best, and others are going to struggle. And I think even within communities, there's going to be differentiation. I think we did some work in Mali recently looking at actually use of weather forecasts to help farmers. But one of the things that my colleagues Jason Vogel and Luigi Andola found was that women are a particular risk because they don't have access to the information. Oftentimes, they can't get the forecast, and then they don't have access. Well, I think less access to land, less access to capital. So I think one of the challenges, as we address these, is looking at how these mechanisms, like microloans, which microlending, which is very promising, but how they play out. And I was encouraged when Michael talks about helping students, and so helping those who are, those who are most at risk, maybe get access to capital and other things. I think is an important consideration in this.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Joe. The fact that you have to really make have a proactive effort here in terms of reaching out to women, students, those that are particularly at risk here. Question then, how do we involve in this instance the private sector, both locally as well as internationally? Is there a role within this framework? Either involve them because they have the technological resources or financial resources, or because they're working in these areas, so they have a stake in being involved. Do you see ways in which we can involve them? And secondly, are you also engaging with domestic agricultural banks? I guess this is more pointed to Charity and Michael, but any thoughts you have would be good.
Yeah, so sorry, I guess I'll go first, but to answer kind of your first question about how to get more people involved, I really think that the technology in the space has been making big strides lately, and is really going to be key to an enabling kind of greater resilience and growth in these areas. Kind of with everybody in these areas has access to cell phones. In ways that didn't before. There's a lot of mobile banking more than money banking happening in a lot of these areas, and so certain infrastructures can be completely skipped if they hadn't existed in these areas before, such as having the mobile banking. And one of the things that Charity and I each kind of touched on is that we're also moving towards technologies that enable a sharing economy in these places, where you can use, as I mentioned before, get higher rates of utilization amongst a larger group of people of this equipment to maximize the benefits that can be had from it, while also spreading out the risk. And again, connected to these mobile payments and understanding the behavior of these smallholders and when they're able to make payments and when they aren't able to. One of the things that is going to be helpful in involving the local domestic banks, with whom we have had conversations with, at a higher level, at a more commercial level. One is understanding that given the risk profile of the smallholder farmers, they tend to stick into the commercial space, large commercial projects or government projects at which they'll finance. But getting them more comfortable with financing the smallholders really does deal with gathering more information. And so kind of within these asset sharing, within these mobile payment platforms, exists the opportunity, which I've been seeing capitalized in different areas, of gathering a lot of information and building a credit profile for people with whom many of these banks wouldn't have known many things about beforehand, which would lead them to not finance them. And so I'm quite optimistic. I know it's not going to be easy. It's going to take a lot of time and effort, but I start to see things that really make me hopeful.
Yeah, just to add on that, our program, we are taking a market systems approach, which means that we are not doing any direct implementation with the producers. We think that sustained resilience is actually about sustained access and adoption of services and products and technologies, which means that an external organization like a project, which comes and goes, is not the best one to be facilitating direct access and direct adoption or even direct information. So we're working with local private sector. And in a market that's as thin as this, where I mentioned, northern Mozambique actually has a fairly thin private agribusiness sector, we are working on trying to identify, small and medium-sized businesses. And as Michael said, to a certain extent, something about a shared economy. Who are the tractor owners, and how can we help them see the opportunity of a smallholder customer and then help them build a business around that? Linkages with financial institutions are then around taking those successful businesses, the input retailers, the tractor service providers, and the threshing service providers, then taking them to the banks and facilitating the finance for them, and not necessarily the smallholder farmers, because we're largely working in rain-fed, and the risk profile just isn't there. So I don't think there's a way around not working with the smallholder or with the local firms. And in our market, it's not only working with a more diverse group and size range, which has its challenges, but also trying to identify innovations within the enterprise sector and bringing them in from outside. What are information platforms that are working in Kenya? What are information platforms that might be being tested in Zambia that we could test here in our market and introduce to a private sector that isn't connected internationally and isn't aware of those learnings and experiences?
Thank you. I'm going to take this opportunity now to open up the floor to some questions. Please make your questions very short rather than expressing your views. And also, before you ask a question, just introduce yourself briefly. Any questions from the floor? Yes.
My name is Anna Pikowski. I'm an agriculture and climate change specialist at the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture. In my experience, obviously there's a lot of different definitions of resilience based on the development goals that people have at different spatial and temporal scales. And I was just wondering if you can give us some insight into how you are measuring resilience at the scales you're working at. I think that gives us a lot of insight into the impact that you're trying to have.
Thank you.
So, all right, I'm happy to sort of jump in on this question of measurement, which is very important. Let me just make a broader comment. I know people have talked about we can measure contributions to greenhouse gas mitigation, across gases and at different scales. Unfortunately, there is no workable, quantifiable, common definition of resilience that we can apply across multiple scales. That said, I think, say, in the case of agriculture, I would look at, well, how do we just define, what are the definitions of success in agriculture in terms of, general, how many calories we're producing per capita, or profitability of farmers, or distribution of profits, number of people engaged, that kind of thing. And I would then sort of overlay climate change on top of that and say, well, we should start with those measures and then see how they do under, say, potential under scenarios of climate change, or as we see more and more extreme events. Let's look at how these things are faring. My sense is, in terms of measuring it, we have to do it sector by sector. It's hard to do this across agriculture and ecosystems, water resources.
Hi, I'll just jump in. As a USA project here on the ground, we do have, the indicators around yield increases and margins, gross margins. But we're really using our numbers of farmers and hectares under new technology is one of our indicators that we're prioritizing the right technology and offering farmers choices that are desirable to them. Another interesting thing that we have, though, we're just coming out of our first full agricultural production season, so we haven't gotten to the point of studying impact in any meaningful way with surveys, but we have an indicator around a household's self-perceived resilience. This is going to be a really interesting custom indicator as we survey households around their own perception of their own resilience. So stay tuned and see what we learn from that process.
Yeah, and one last thing to kind of mention on that. Obviously, we have more specific things that we look at is each particular team or project, depending on what you're working on, set KPIs that match for you. And ours was number of people you expand access to finance towards. But I think this all points back to what's really helpful about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, that it kind of sets a common language for which we can kind of each speak and share what we're working on. And so if you're looking at those, for example, goal number 2, achieving food security, improved nutrition, promoting sustainable agriculture, it's one for us. And within that, we can mention the specific things that we're doing for that. Goal 13, climate change and its impacts, and strengthening resiliency and adaptive capacity there. And so I can't speak, too much in detail about it, but I, have, already felt and been excited by, how that is able to kind of create a common framework for having conversation across different sectors. It might not be, necessarily seeming to measure the same things, but at least showing, kind of where the impacts are and what you can, talk about.
Thanks. Thanks, Michael. I know that officially we are at the end of the hour, but given that there are a few more questions, so we'll continue on for maybe max of 10 minutes. So again, quick questions and keep your answer short, guys. All right.
So I just wanted to follow up on what Charity.
Just introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Carol Stoney. I'm the Director of Monitoring and Evaluation at Winrock International, so I'm really interested in the issue of resilience measurement. And I want to follow up with what Charity said about doing household surveys on perceived resilience. I'm just wondering if, will you have to do some training with the households first on what we mean by resilience, how we're defining it, or will you just let them define it themselves? Or I know some of the indexes that try to measure resilience, they have indicators for household surveys where they ask questions like, how many months of the year are you food insecure or something?
Okay. All right. Charity, any specifics in that?
Great question. Love to talk to you more about that. I feel like if we define resilience in a set definition, then you're influencing the answer. But I'm not sure that the questions have been identified yet, as we're early on in our process.
Other questions? Okay, yes.
I have a question. So this speaks a little bit to, I'm Coca Casa. I'm Senior Director for Business Development at Winrock. This speaks a little bit to what you were saying, Charity, around the time frame of smallholder farmers, and then also what you were talking about with the trade-offs. So do we have any successes of using technology to help smallholder farmers, and maybe even commercial farmers, do this kind of decision-making around the trade-offs? So doing modeling around, different soil versus, all the different variables that you came up with. Have there been any successes using technology? Are any private sector companies interested in that? Is there a way to incentivize them to try and finance that? It would be great to get your input on that.
So two things. One of the things is I think that, as I mentioned, in my experience, rain-fed farmers make decisions and evaluate risks fairly similarly to other rain-fed farmers. And so evaluating risks isn't necessarily the problem, but offering them options that they can weigh and balance, and giving them sufficient experience with those options to where they have the information necessary to make those decisions are things that we are trying to tackle. And at least in this context, the farmers just haven't been exposed to a really wide range, or even things that they've been trained on, they don't have access to. And so it's not a viable option it's not a viable choice for them. On the other side, your question was about so one of the things that our project intends to do, and we've been talking a lot about, is a technology resilience impact assessment metric. And we've been working with the Winrock Ecosystem Services team. And some of that, the one slide that I presented on the trade-offs and resilience, where we talk about, shocks and stresses of the economic variety, shocks and stresses of the environmental variety, and then community or household variety. Some of this conversation of these trade-offs is coming from the initial work in this technology resilience impact assessment metric. And that was intended to provide, or is intended to provide, sort of quite a bit of analytics in the background, but a very simple set of dials, like this is good for labor but bad for the economics, or good for the environment and good for mediocre on economics, to try to give a little bit more data to producers in their decision making.
Great. Thanks, Charity. A question that came up, again, this was online, and again, just for all of you, if you can answer, which is, what are some examples of insurance products for smallholder farmers that you're either using currently or things that you think could work?
We don't really have insurance options here in our corridor. Joel, maybe you have ideas?
You know, I'm not an expert on insurance for agriculture. I think one thing, though, to point out, there are other schemes to try to provide support. And actually, I don't know if you want to bring up that picture, or if we can show. This is something. I have the pleasure. I'm editing a book, and Pablo Suarez from the Pardee Center at Boston University is working with the International Red Cross on something called forecast-based financing in Togo. And what they have there is you've got rivers that are flooding. They come into a dam. The dam overflows, and then downstream farmers and others are at risk from the flooding. And so, you know, rather than wait for the flood to occur, what you can do is you can certainly see the waters in the dam rising, or even see the waters upstream rising, and use that information to at least better prepare for the eventual flooding that's going to happen. You know, make insurance available, but also what this picture shows is just distribution of supplies that are happening, like water and other things are happening in advance of the floods, so people are ready once things occur. So it isn't, you know, sometimes we think about insurance sometimes narrowly in terms of the financial insurance, but it also can be other forms of providing aid. And, you know, this is an example of, as I say, of using even a forecast of an event to get ready.
Thanks, Joe. Any other questions? Anyone else? Any questions online?
Yeah, I can read one from online. This person says, one of our donors just did a social return on investment study on which interventions have the most social ROI in our program to address child labor in smallholder sourcing areas. Highest on their list were smallholder irrigation and locally produced clean cook stove production, which both save labor and have economic and environmental benefits. Are there other similar innovative solutions that we should be promoting in our efforts to reduce labor burdens?
Okay. So that was an example of something that's working, and the question is, are there other such examples that you can share?
Hi, this is Michael here. And, I think we might be talking about the same thing and trying to add on, but just to introduce it, you know, as we've mentioned, you know, if you're looking at the servitization and being able to offer, you know, tractor services and other such services in that, you know, having a smallholder purchase services as opposed, you know, to purchasing the labor for themselves, you know, as a way to be, you know, cost competitive and really help them out. But one of the things that we often see, you know, is that this can also help in not necessarily the, you know, the purchase of labor, but in the, you know, the family hours involved in labor can be decreased if you're having somebody come in and paying them to use a tractor to plow a field, for example, rather than, you know, having, you know, spending, you know, week, 2 weeks with the, you know, your kids to, you know, dig by hand, if you will. And so in that circumstances, I think, you know, you do see the impact. You know, I don't have any measurements on that, but that's one of the, you know, kind of externalities that we've seen that has been, you know, kind of impactful, where it might not necessarily be shown in the actual expenses changing, but the amount of time spent by, you know, the family group of the smallholder at different tasks.
I was just going to add something quickly. You know, so when we prioritized a suite of technologies for this first production season, where we're specifically testing out models to increase access and adoption, and yes, mechanized land preparation services are one of them. But we were looking at the existing production systems and trying to understand how we could reduce waste, as opposed to get them to adopt something that requires additional labor or additional cash expenditures. Any smallholder farmer, and many here in this corridor do, any smallholder farmer that's already paying manual labor to prepare their land has the cash for accessible and cost-effective, cost-competitive mechanization services. Some of this thinking comes from lean manufacturing and lean production theory where you're looking, which is the Toyota way, and everyone gets trained in this, but it's being applied more and more in the agriculture sector, where you look at the system, you understand what's happening now, and you really look for ways to reduce waste, which is cash, labor, land, other resources, and focus your prioritization on providing alternatives and options in those areas.
Thank you. And again, at this point, I want to thank all the panelists and everyone that's listening in and those that are here. I think it was a good round of discussions. As promised, we're not going to come up with a silver bullet to any of these questions or issues, but the whole idea here is, we're sharing ideas and thoughts and hopefully generate more discussion. Feel free to reach out and communicate and ask questions, and we'll try and connect you back to the panelists if you have any specific questions. And also, this particular webinar will be available on our website, winrock.org. So if you need to, I think in a couple of days it'll be live, so you'll be able to access this. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.